Hey, this is Geisha 305, and I decided to do a little research on Horn Island in Mississippi, where Nolan Wells' body was discovered. I found some details on the fight for the Gulf Coast access Jim Crow era. During the Jim Crow era, Mississippi beaches and coastal access points were heavily segregated. While Horn Island itself was federal land, the boat launches and piers required to reach it from cities like Biloxi and Ocean Springs were restricted to white residents. And this is the history of Horn Island, which Nolan Wells and the three young men that were on the boat with him went to on the 4th of July. The Wade ends in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Civil rights icon Dr. Gilbert Mason Sr. led Wade End protests to desegregate the Gulf Coast beaches. This activism eventually opened up boat launches to black citizens, allowing them to finally utilize the barrier islands like Horn Island for recreation and fishing. Did you know that the indigenous people, long before European colonization or the transatlantic slave trade, the island was used seasonally by the Biloxi and the Pascagoula tribes for hunting and fishing? French colonization in 1699 and subsequent American expansion forcibly displaced these indigenous populations from the Gulf Coast entirely. Horn Island is entirely uninhabited, undeveloped, and lacks fresh water or cell phone service. Because it requires a private boat to access, the vast majority of people who visit the island return to the mainland the same day, keeping overall incident numbers low. And if these type of precautions are being made, how was Nolan Wells left behind? Due to the generations of economic disparities and the legacy of Jim Crow segregation along the Gulf Coast, boat ownership and private island recreation have historically been overwhelmingly white. This demographic imbalance means that historically, the vast majority of visitors to the wilderness barrier islands have not been black. While standard maritime accidents or accidental drownings occur in the Gulf of Mexico, historical local police records in Mississippi from earlier decades frequently omitted or glossed over the race of victims unless a crime was actively suspected or it drew local media coverage, like this Nolan Wells case. If the media wasn't so broad about this young man, it would have been swept under the rug. Even without physical signs on the island shores, the legal and social reality of Mississippi during the Jim Crow era meant the island was treated as an exclusively white space. Black residents who attempted to use the beaches on the mainland were routinely threatened or arrested by police. Let's talk about the whites-only mainland barrier. The public boat launches, harbors, and piers on the mainland that were required to reach Horn Island were strictly segregated. Because black citizens were barred from using these coastal launch points, they were effectively locked out of reaching the barrier islands entirely. Horn Island was historically under federal oversight and later designated as a national wilderness area under the National Park Service. Federal lands technically did not have state-sanctioned Jim Crow signage, but local law enforcement and white boaters on the mainland rigorously policed who was allowed to access the water. It was not until the historic Biloxi Wade End protests led by Dr. Gilbert Mason in the late 1950s and early 1960s that the Mississippi Gulf Coast beaches and their corresponding boat launches were legally integrated, finally giving black residents the legal right to access the coastal waters and islands. On Horn Island, Mississippi in the 1930s, the island was primarily utilized as a private hunting and game preserve. Though regional Jim Crow era newspapers often ignored violence and tragedies within the black community to downplay racist atrocities, it has only been documented historically. People on Horn Island primarily hunted waterfowl, ducks, swamp rabbits, and wild hogs, while early regional farmers actively hunted eagles. Because Horn Island is a barrier island with an ecosystem of sand dunes, pine flats, and inland lagoons, it never hosted large mainland game like white-tailed deer or black bears. Today, all hunting is strictly prohibited. Horn Island is federally protected, uninhabited national wilderness area managed by the National Park Service, where visitors only fish, camp, and bird watch. Now on the flip side, Horn Island and nearby Ship Island, Mississippi served as a vital stop on the Underground Railroad, functioning as refuge for the freedom seekers who escaped slavery to join the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. In December 1863, at least 8 enslaved men escaped from a sawmill in Moss Point, Mississippi, and successfully navigated the waters of the Mississippi Sound to reach Horn Island. They were rescued from the island by the USS Calhoun, a Union Navy gunboat that was part of the blockade in the Mississippi Sound. These These men officially enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Two of the sailors, Solomon Gregory and Ebenezer Jenkins, served for the duration of the war and later returned to Mars Point as free men. Horn Island and Ship Island were officially recognized for their historical significance as part of the National Park Service National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.